This is Just Right. Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 3. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 2. Chapter 3. Gator fingered the long envelope in his hands, waiting for the pole-climbing, frozen lake-swimming woman to look up from where she stood beside the cash register. A small table directly in front of him held small, homey-looking Christmas decorations. Large, beautifully decorated wreaths and other pine-type decorations hung on the walls. Because of his size, he often felt boxed in when indoors. The small trailer that served as the tree farm office amplified that feeling. She still hadn't noticed him. He squelched the disdain, threatening to pucker his lips. Apparently, Avery was a cat person. Hard to label her as anything else with the long-haired furball she had strapped to her chest in one of those carrier things a normal woman would put her baby in. No wonder she panicked so fiercely over his dogs. He shifted his feet awkwardly in the small tree farm office. Apparently, she didn't hear the jingle of bells on the door when he walked in, or the door opening and closing. It's not like he had snuck in. He wasn't duck hunting after all. Not today. She rearranged the photos on the counter next to the cash register and bit her lip. That same oddly protective, tingling feeling bloomed in his chest again. The one he'd felt as he stood at the bottom of the light pole and again when he charged into the pond. This woman was way too much his opposite for him to want to have anything more than a passing acquaintance with her. He looked at the cat again. It was ugly enough to be some kind of purebred. He cleared his throat. Excuse me? The woman jumped 3 feet into the air with a screech that only barely drowned out the cat's startled meow. Her hand flew out, knocking over the soda can beside her. More frenzied flying and screeching occurred as Avery grabbed the can, set it upright, and struggled to save the pictures from ruin. It was odd that she even had pictures. Digital had taken over actual handheld pictures for the rest of the world. "I'm so sorry. I didn't hear you come in." She finished gathering her pictures up. One hand stroked the ugly cat strapped to her chest. Its face looked like it smashed into a wall at some point in its life, but then Gator thought of his mother and the snowman. He still didn't like cats, but he allowed that a dreadful face didn't necessarily equate to a nasty disposition, although the thing was a cat. "You should have said something," Avery exclaimed. "I was working on this and I get so focused on things that I lose track of everything else that's going on around me. And, oh, I forgot to thank you for rescuing me from the pond." Her lips turned down. "Although it was your mean, nasty dogs that chased me into it." Gator opened his mouth to inform her that his dogs were not nasty or mean. They were actually elderly and quite nice, having never bitten a single person in all their long years. But she had continued on, and on, confirming his suspicion that in that area, at least, she wasn't like most women who excelled at the silent treatment. He tilted his head as words continued to flow out of her mouth. A woman like her might drive a man to appreciate the silent treatment. Avery put her fingers to her mouth. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing it again." She stopped talking and looked at him. Quiet. So it must be his turn to speak. He stared at her as the seconds ticked by, suddenly and inexplicably at a loss for words. Her cheeks grew pink and she reached a hand up and stroked the cat again. The sight broke his stare and he turned his head, tapping the envelope he carried against his palm. Right. He'd forgotten why he was even there. Probably stunned by the ugliness of that stupid cat. "I'm looking for Fink." She tilted her head and looked up at him. Something about her eyes, which were clear blue like a bottomless glacial lake, gave her a glow of sincerity that he couldn't shake. It didn't matter what her eyes looked like. This woman wasn't any less mercenary than the rest of her species. But today, his mouth wasn't taking orders from the thinking side of his brain, apparently, because it opened and said, "I'm sorry my dog scared you. Twice now. They're really not mean or ferocious." "They just want to eat me." The lady shrugged fatalistically. "Actually, scientists say that if a human dies in their apartment, their cats will eat them, but a dog would starve to death first." "And they've proved that how?" she asked, with a wave of her hand and a flash of her shiny pink nails. How had she climbed the light pole with nails like that? By killing a cat and studying the microscopic clump of cells that passes for a brain in that animal. He lifted a shoulder to indicate it didn't matter. "I don't know. The article I read didn't say." And he hadn't needed any further proof since the article simply put into words what he had known as fact forever. A cat couldn't be trusted any farther than a woman. Except if he died in his apartment, a woman would pick his body clean of anything that might have any monetary value before skipping town with his credit cards, money, and bank account information. He didn't think a woman would actually eat him, although with women, one could never be completely sure. "You can't believe everything you read on the internet. In fact, most of it is fiction. Why, I read the other day that string musicians have bigger frontal lobes than brass musicians. But everyone and their stepsister knows that brass musicians are the most intelligent people in the orchestra." Avery's perfectly bobbed hair swung around her head as she spoke, giving even more life to her personality than the ruffled blouse and saucy skirt. The only thing that was a downer on her whole body was the sour-looking cat that glared at him through half-closed eyes. "If you value that sort of thing." Her hand stilled over the pictures she seemed to be sorting. "And that means?" Playing an instrument has nothing to do with how smart you are?" "Oh," she brightened. "Exactly right. Do you play?" "No." The hopeful expression melted off of Avery's face. "I'm marching in the Christmas parade next week with Love's professional musicians, and we could use some new talent." "Can't help you out." And wouldn't want to. Funny that the idea of marching in a parade gave him the stomach heaves, but he'd always done the lumberjack competition without a second thought. "Does the farm still donate the trees for the tree trimming contest?" "Yep." She gave a decisive nod that set her hair to swinging again. "They'll be cutting those next week." "Well, if Fink needs help getting them cut and into town, I'll give him a hand." Her eyes widened like she was surprised he'd offered to help. "Okay," she said. "He and Ellie had a late doctor's appointment with one of the boys. I'll tell him when he gets back." "Great. And could you give him this? I'm headed out of town for a few days." He held up the envelope in his hand. "It's the bid on tearing the barn down." Avery's mouth flattened. "You know, just because something's old doesn't mean that it's worthless." "I never said it was worthless." He laid the envelope on the counter beside the pictures that she had spread out. "But now that you mention it, it's funny the way a woman's mind always goes to the money. How much is it worth?" He shook his head. Avery had that captivating energy about her, but he wasn't fooled. All women, with a few notable exceptions, his mother being one, needed money, and plenty of it, in order to be happy. You want to tear it down. With a small investment, that barn could be making Fink and Ellie a nice, tidy sum. It's an eyesore, and it needs to go. And he needed the money for his mother. Even more so since this morning as he'd been walking out, he'd noticed the pink foreclosure notice on his mother's desk. His throat tightened and his forehead throbbed. Surely they couldn't foreclose just because the home equity line was 6 months behind. But he knew they could and would. If only his mother had told him. It would have been tight, but he could have paid those payments with his regular salary, or close to it. But now, with a lump sum needed to stop the proceedings, he really had no choice but to convince Fink to tear down that barn. It's not an eyesore. It's a historic building that deserves the dignity of being restored to its former grandeur. Her cat stared at him with evil yellow eyes. He ignored it. It's just an old bank barn that has seen better days. They cost more to maintain than they're worth. Sometimes you think things are old and worn out, but they just need the right person to come along and show them some love. We're talking about an inanimate object. He shook his head. She acted like he suggested shooting her grandmother. It was a barn, for goodness sake. It shouldn't matter to her if it got torn down or not. He opened his mouth to tell her just that, when the door opened, little Christmas bells jingling, and a couple strode in. After a Christmas tree, probably. He had thought, for a few moments, that maybe Avery was different. Exactly what his lonely heart wanted to think. He stuffed down something that felt a lot like disappointment and strode back toward the door, nodding to the couple who looked vaguely familiar. He wouldn't feel guilty for wanting to tear the barn down. To get Avery on his side, he should have pointed out how much money Fink and Ellie would make from the sale of the old boards and beams. Too late. And he didn't care what she thought. Not much, anyway. Mrs. Frank's son must be some kind of super craftsman if he made these in high school. Avery replaced another burnt-out light in the wooden cutout of a skier doing a flip. It was the last in a 17 cutout line, which started with the skier on his feet heading downhill. A super electrician, too, since Mrs. Franks swears that these things work in perfect time. Jillian Powell sat with one ankle behind her head as she untangled a string of blue lights for over the walkway arch. Mrs. Frank's entire large front lot was stuffed with motion-coordinated Christmas decorations her son had made for her before he graduated and left home. They had yet to turn everything on and confirm that it all worked together, but Mrs. Franks swore it would. I like Christmas just as much as the next person, but this seems a little excessive, even to me. Jillian dropped her leg from behind her head and stood, bending down and throwing one leg up in the air in a perfect split as she gathered the lights from the ground. You can never have too many decorations. Avery started up the ladder under the arch. At least not at Christmas. You can't look at all this and not smile. And that's what Mrs. Franks needs. Cheered up. A reason to be happy. It should make her happy that her son is back from out west. After hooking the lights on the end of her shoe, Jillian did a slow handstand, lifting the lights up to Avery. With anyone else, Avery might assume she was practicing a routine or maybe showing off. With Jillian, Avery had decided you could take the girl out of the circus, but you apparently could not take the circus out of the girl. Have you seen him? Jillian asked, her voice sounding perfectly normal, despite the fact that she was upside down and holding herself up with her hands. Mrs. Franks said he left for a few days, something about a project he promised to do. As she spoke, She remembered Gator saying he was going out of town for a few days, and Avery's gaze fell on the G. Franks printed on the underside of the arch where she pinned the lights. The same G. Franks that was on all the decorations in the yard. Her hand stilled.
"Has Mrs. Franks ever said what her son's name is?"
"Nope." Jillian dropped her feet to the ground as Avery took the last of the lights in hand.
"She says, 'My son this and my son that.' She only has one child, and I know she's described him as compassionate, articulate. Don't forget sweet," Jillian said, "and kind. She uses that word a lot."
Avery bit her lip. It couldn't be. Sweet, gentle Mrs. Franks could not be the mother of that huge, uncouth mountain man.
"Didn't she say he was married?"
In the process of lifting one of her feet behind her head, Jillian whipped her head around so fast she stumbled. She quickly tucked her head to her stomach and did a somersault. She landed on her back on the wet, cold ground and blinked up at Avery.
"I'm not sure. Separated, maybe? Odd question coming from the all men leave for younger, prettier women, so why bother person."
Avery leaned against the steps of the ladder and looked down at Jillian.
"See, he's separated."
She ignored the part of her that eddied in disappointment.
"He's already left his wife for someone younger and prettier." "You don't know that. It's a safe bet." "I disagree with you, but I'm also going to say we all have our little hang-ups, and that one's yours. That and your cat. Where is it, by the way?" "I left Mrs. Prissypants at home. Ever since she jumped out of her carrier when I was setting up the farm display for the Christmas decoration next week, I've been afraid I'd lose her, so I've not been carrying her off the farm." "I'm telling you, she jumped out because she saw the dog catcher. Animals hate him."
Jillian had tucked her elbows in and folded her legs and feet in such a way as to form her body into a ball. She rocked back and forth. "You mark my words, there's bones in his basement." Avery snorted, but didn't argue. They'd already had this discussion. Ellie had said that McCoy Rodning was a genuine nice guy, a local fellow, well-liked in the community and good at his job. But nothing anyone said would convince Jillian that he was anything but Jeffrey Dahmer's evil twin. Jeffrey being the good twin, of course. Avery gave a silent sigh. Some people were just not meant to get along. "At any rate, Miss Prissypants is too valuable to risk losing her." The screen door slapped as Avery stepped off the ladder. Mrs. Franks, bundled in a heavy coat, with a long scarf wrapped around her bare head and neck, stepped out onto the porch. "I was about to come in and get you," Avery called, folding the ladder and carrying it to the porch where she leaned it against the railing. "We're ready for the initial lighting." "I'm giving you the honor of flipping the switch, Avery." "Are you sure? I thought you would want to." "No, tradition demands that the person who does the most work setting up the displays gets to flip the switch. Usually that's been my son, but this year it was definitely you. You've been working for days on this. It was sweet of Jillian to come help you today." A little bite of guilt pinched Avery. Jillian had manned the Christmas tree sales counter so she could spend extra time helping Mrs. Franks. She deserved to flip the switch. Jillian waved her hands. "No, I'm good. I wouldn't have had the patience to replace all the burnt-out lights and read the diagrams about where each piece of the display went in the yard. I can tell by your face that you think you owe me, but the little bit of untangling I did here today makes me want to go bury my frustration in cheese fries and a chocolate milkshake." "So it's up to you." Mrs. Frank's smile was warm and sincere. She could not be Gator's mother, not Gator of the woman-eating dogs. Avery and Jillian stood at the switch with Mrs. Franks, whose expectant smile never faltered. Avery reached for the black knob and flicked it down with a snap. Immediately, the yard and surrounding acreage illuminated with brightly colored lights. White lights and red ribbons had always been Avery's favorite Christmas decorations, but she had to admit the work had been worth it. The smile on Mrs. Frank's face rivaled the brightness of the decorations in her yard.
It looks just like it did 10 years ago when my son lit them for the last time,
Mrs. Franks said breathlessly. Her cool, dry hand slid into Avery's.
Thank you so much. It was fun,
Avery said and meant it.
Both of you come inside for some hot cocoa. I have those pictures you asked for too, Avery.
Mrs. Franks slid her fingers out and turned toward the door. Jillian moved toward the steps.
I can't. I promised Ellie I'd be back at the counter by dark to help with the crowds. But you can stay for a few minutes.
Mrs. Franks turned to Avery.
Sure, I'm excited about those pictures. I really wanted to come up with some old pictures of the farm to copy and frame for Fink and Ellie for Christmas. I'll see you guys later,
Jillian said as she walked on her hands down the porch stairs.
Thanks for the help, honey,
Mrs. Franks called to her before she gripped Avery's elbow and they turned and walked in the front door. Lights from the decorations in the yard twinkled in the glass.
I wish I could pay you. If you would have paid us, it would have been work.
Avery patted Mrs. Frank's hand.
I'm glad we could do it.
15 minutes later, they sat at the old oak table in Mrs. Frank's cozy kitchen, steaming mugs of hot chocolate in front of each of them and old pictures from the 70s and 80s spread out on the scarred wood surface.
This is the courthouse where it sat on State Street before the flood of '72. State Street? In love? There aren't any houses there. It's a park. That's right. They were all washed away, the remnants of Hurricane Agnes.
She tapped the picture with a thin finger.
No one died. That's why we decided it was okay to make a park. I think it was the next year or the one after that when they built the levee and started having the Christmas celebration there. They've been having it for almost 50 years? Yep, and every year it gets bigger.
She tapped a picture that was almost all white.
There's the blizzard of '93. 3 feet of snow. That's the school. The school? The same building the kids use today. Yep, it was only about 20 or 30 years old in that picture. You can't tell because the snow was so deep. That was a March storm. The whole town was shut down for almost a week. Roads were closed. Nothing could get through, not even the milk truck. Farmers' tanks overflowed, and they had to dump their milk down the drain.
She tapped another picture, and Avery's heart jumped. It was her barn.
There's Fink and Ellie's barn. Of course, at the time, it belonged to Ellie's first husband's grandparents, Sam and Marge Bright.
It wasn't her barn. She knew that, of course. She pushed aside the little ache in her heart and pointed to the picture.
They must have had the area where Harper's small apartment is now planted in Christmas trees. I can see about a foot of the tops of the trees through the snow.
Harper, Ellie's daughter, was now married and living in Chile. Mrs. Franks laughed.
I do believe you're right.
She considered the picture for another moment. Avery noted that there were no missing boards on the sides of the barn as there were now. The old milk house still stood in the picture, although it was half buried in snow. All that was left of it now was the cement foundation and 2 feet of stone walls.
Oh, my!
Mrs. Franks fished a picture out of the pile and held it up slowly.
I haven't seen this one in years.
Something in Mrs. Franks' tone caused Avery to look at her face. Her top lip was pulled between her teeth, and her eyes glistened with moisture. Avery glanced back at the picture in her hand. It was in full color and looked newer than the ones they had been looking at. In the photo, the women's hair was big, very big, with frizzy permed curls. A few wore knee warmers. None of the men had sideburns or any facial hair. At least 2 older people wore timeless, ugly Christmas sweaters. Lights glittered in the background, illuminating bales of straw.
That's the inside of the barn. It's some kind of party that was held in Fink and Ellie's barn.
Avery tried to be dignified, but she knew her smile was big and sloppy and probably made her look like a 5-year-old who had just met Santa Claus.
Yes, it was.
Mrs. Franks' voice seemed dreamy. Avery wondered if she even realized that she had spoken. She stroked the edge of the picture, then gently pushed aside the pile of photos.
Here,
she said, picking up a similar colored photo with a young couple standing, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. The man towered over the woman, and her left hand lay on his chest possessively. A small diamond twinkled on her hand.
I just saw that man,
Avery whispered. His dogs had tried to eat her.
That was the night Jake asked me to marry him.
Her voice wobbled.
We looked so happy.
They did, despite the fact that a very disturbing thought had taken root in her brain. Avery couldn't look at the picture without smiling back at the couple.
You look like you're in love. We were. That was a magical night. What I wouldn't do to go back and relive it.
You can never go back, only forward. Avery thought of the old proverb, but didn't voice it aloud. Mrs. Franks' face had a healthy glow and a beautiful smile. Avery hadn't ever seen her this happy and alive. It was like the memories that swirled through her head had brought out the life that the cancer had tried to smother.
He was killed not long after that picture was taken. You never married? No. But I know. My last name is Franks. I changed it after he died, after his son, my son, came to live with me.
Avery blinked, trying to figure out the puzzle Mrs. Franks had presented. Mrs. Franks gave a laugh.
I can see the wheels turning.
She tapped the picture.
It's a long story, but Jake's first wife left him and their small son for another woman. He hired me to watch his boy, and, well...
She shrugged.
We fell in love.
Her gaze seemed to caress the picture again.
I raised her son as mine. Don't these memories make you sad?
Avery bit her tongue. Maybe she shouldn't have asked that question. There were 100 other questions wanting to tumble out her mouth, the biggest and most pressing one being about the man, her husband, in the picture, who looked exactly like.
I suppose they should, but I'm not sad anymore. It's been 30 years. Looking at those pictures, remembering that magical night, all those feelings come back. The newness of being in love and the happiness as I thought of our life together. The lights and friends and fun, great food, good times, and the fairy tale of Christmas. No, there's no sadness. Maybe the faintest longing for what might have been. I see.
Avery studied the grain of wood on the table. hesitating to ask the question that lay like a tremolo on her tongue. She took a breath.
"What's your son's name?" "I guess you haven't met him, have you?"
Mrs. Franks lifted her head and looked at Avery, her eyes still sparkling.
"Gator. His name is Gator, and I'll have to arrange for you two to meet. I think you'll like him."
No. Avery wanted Mrs. Franks to take an interest in life. She wanted to cheer her and take her mind off her sickness, but she didn't want to spend any more time in Gator's presence than absolutely necessary. She struggled for diplomacy over the extreme rejection she wanted to issue.
"That's sweet, but I've actually already met him. And his dogs. They were—"
Avery paused, trying to find a word that wouldn't scare Mrs. Franks.
"just the sweetest dogs you'll ever meet."
Mrs. Franks finished for her.
"I know. They were from the last litter that Grandpa ever bred. They mean the world to Gator, but they have to be getting up in years. He slept with them in high school, and they went everywhere with him. They were the only thing he took with him when he married and moved west."
Gator was married. Of course he was. Not separated, not divorced. Just every time she saw him, he was alone except for the dogs. Now that she knew for sure he was married, she would absolutely put him out of her mind.
"They don't have parties like that anymore."
Mrs. Franks was looking at the photo again, tracing the edge with her finger.
"That barn gave the party character." "Yeah."
And they were going to tear it down. Gator was going to tear it down. Not that she could say that to Mrs. Franks. Although, she bet he wouldn't destroy it if he knew how much it meant to his mother. Or maybe he still would. It wasn't like Avery knew him or the way he thought or anything.
"I wonder if Fink and Ellie would consider hosting another party there."
Mrs. Franks mused aloud. Avery bit her tongue.
"I never really thought about a bucket list. I've been content with my life. But if there's one thing that I'd love to do again, I'd love to relive that night."
She tapped the picture gently, then lifted her head. This time her eyes looked tired and older than the mid-50s age that she must be. Cancer had a way of stealing a person's youth, along with their joy.
"Do you think—"
Her voice trailed off. Avery's heart twisted. She wasn't here to be a do-gooder. She wasn't even here to help a neighbor in need, although she might have started out with that in mind. She was here today to put up Mrs. Franks' Christmas decorations because she had come to admire and respect her, and she wanted to ease her burden and give her a reason to smile. That had to be why, even though she knew the barn was slated for demolition, she opened her mouth and said,
"I bet Fink and Ellie would let us have a Christmas party there this year. In fact, I'm sure they would."
Mrs. Franks beamed. Avery reached over and sorted through the pictures.
"I can decorate for it. Do we have more pictures to give me a better idea?"
She could make the decorations match exactly if they had good enough pictures. Mrs. Franks almost seemed to bounce in her chair.
"I have a ton of pictures in boxes in the attic. I'll have to have Gator bring them down for me."
Avery's stomach grated like an out-of-tune orchestra. She'd promised something she had no hope of delivering. Mrs. Franks might actually get sicker because of the disappointment if Avery couldn't convince Fink and Ellie. Quite possibly Avery had set in motion what could be her final disappointment. She had to look on the bright side. It could work out. It wouldn't be a money-making proposition for anyone, but maybe she could frame it in such a way that it would appeal to Fink and Ellie's compassionate nature. They both helped and volunteered in the community and were always open for ways to give back. Just this week, they were donating the Christmas trees for the town Christmas festival. They had said the barn was too expensive to insure. They would need insurance to do the party. She thought about the money that she had been saving to buy a better tuba. She wanted to buy it before she went to audition in Washington, D.C. on the 15th of December, and she had all but a couple $100s in her savings account. There might be enough money there to take out an insurance policy for a one-night party.
"Did you hear me, honey?"
Mrs. Franks asked.
No."
She had been way too deep in her thoughts. She'd not even realized that Mrs. Franks had spoken.
"I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I said parties like this one are a lot of work."
Mrs. Franks put a hand on her shoulder.
"I can't ask you to put that kind of time into a frivolous thing just to make me happy. It's a nice idea, but let's let it rest." "You didn't ask. I offered. And I love planning and decorating. I want to recreate the decorations and the menu and the music. Well, maybe not the music. Was it 80s rock?"
Mrs. Franks chuckled.
"It was all Christmas music performed by the school orchestra. In fact, if I recall correctly, that was their concert venue that year because the auditorium was closed since they were removing the asbestos tiles from the ceiling." "I might not be able to recreate a school building renovation to cause the auditorium to be closed."
"That's okay. They had a set of twins who went on to play professionally, and they sounded much better than most school orchestras, or so I'm told. You're the music expert." Immediately, Avery wondered if the twins that had gone on to play professionally were the Humphrey twins from the Philadelphia Waterfront Orchestra that she'd played with. They were the right age. She made a mental note to call them. They weren't exactly close friends, but she had a good professional relationship with them. As good as a brass player could have with someone from the string section, anyway.
"We'll figure something out."
Avery nodded decisively. She'd thought that a new tuba with better resonation might give her a slight edge when she auditioned, but right now, she'd rather spend her money on insurance so Mrs. Franks could have her party than on a new tuba that probably wouldn't make any difference in her sound. After all, she got the position at the Philadelphia Waterfront Orchestra with her old tuba. She was kind of attached to it anyway and hadn't relished the idea of setting it aside for a new instrument. Felt too much like the way her dad had set aside his wife and daughter for a new, younger wife. Whether or not he had children with that woman, she couldn't say. She hadn't talked to him since he walked out when she was 10. The last thing he'd said to her was, "Why don't you put all that hot air to good use and learn to play an instrument?" So she did. Take that, Dad.
"I'll talk to Ellie and Fink, and if they'll let me, I'll be back to get all the details. But I don't want to tire you out." "Planning a party is fun."
Mrs. Franks smiled as she said it, but Avery recognized the droop of her shoulders and the tightened lines around her mouth. There had been a lot going on for Mrs. Franks today with the decorations and now the party talk. Obviously, it had worn her out.
"Do you feel well enough to eat the chicken rice soup I brought? I'll warm it up." "That would be wonderful." "How about I help you onto the couch?"
They had walked back down the hall and reached the living room doorway when the door opened, and Gator stood outlined in the light from the Christmas lights. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.